Like all woodworkers, I get the occasional request to make small items for Christmas, birthdays, or teachers' gifts. These items typically don't require a lot of material and are perfect use for my cutoffs. I keep my cutoffs in vertical bins to make it easy to browse for the perfect pieces for my small projects. Today, I have 2 such gifts to make, a succulent planter and a pencil box. So I'll be using this curly maple for both with walnut as my accents. And I'll be using this walnut with sick crotch figure for the top of the pencil box. So for the succulent planter, I start by laying out where I want the accent stripe to be and I mark it with a pencil. I then cut to my line at the table saw and insert the walnut strip to get a visual. Next, I glue my strips together using water-resistant glue since this project will likely come in contact with water at some point. Once everything's in the clamps, I set it aside to dry and begin working on the pencil box. I begin by scribing a line on my workpiece with my marking gauge. I'm going to be resawing this 1-inch board in half and I want a guideline to follow. Over at the bandsaw, I set my fence to the correct distance based on my guidelines and I use a magnetic feather board to help hold the workpiece to the fence. I'll put a link below in the description if you're interested in checking out this feather board. Alright, now that my board is resawn in half, I send the 2 pieces through the drum sander to clean up the blade marks. I'm also doing it to get my pieces down to final thickness. I'm aiming for 3/8 of an inch and I check my work with my calipers, sanding until I get to my number. Next I set up to cut the grooves in the top and the bottom of the pencil box and I do this at the table saw. I set my fence to 1/4 inch from the blade, I make my groove 1/8 of an inch wide, which is the width of the blade, and I go 3/16 of an inch deep, which is half the thickness of the material. Now it's time to make the donuts. Cut the miters. I use my digital angle gauge to set my blade to 45 degrees. Again, I'll leave a link to the gauge in the description below. I make the first cut in each of my 2 work pieces. I then flip each piece over and cut the miter on the opposite side. I then take the remainder of each of the 2 pieces and cut the short sides of my box from those. Being cautious of the blade, I use a pencil to steady my workpiece in order to make these cuts. And now that I have my 4 sides cut, I line them up to check the joints and make sure they're nice and tight. Next I set my blade back to 90 degrees to cut the bottom of the box to width and to cut the rabbets on all 4 sides to fit in the grooves that I just cut in the sides. And the final step here at the table saw is to cut one end of my box short to allow for the lid to slide in and out of the top groove. So for assembly, I made this jig to use as a reference surface and I covered it with clear packing tape to prevent glue from sticking. I go ahead and line up my pieces to make sure that I get the order right. So here's a quick tip on checking the fit of your miters. Place a piece of paper or note card, anything that's bright white, on the jig and set your 2 adjoining sides on top, pressing them against the fence. When you press your 2 sides together, you shouldn't see any white showing through the joint. If you do see a gap, just finesse that with some sandpaper or block plane until the gap is gone. Now I lay down some blue tape to act as clamps and I lay my sides down in the proper order, making sure to register them against the fence and tight to one another. This will make sure everything is aligned properly. I then spread glue in each joint. And don't go crazy with the glue here because you don't want a mess of squeeze out to deal with. I add the bottom of the box and roll everything up, wrapping the tape at the end over to complete the glue up. I finesse the joints as needed to ensure they are tight and then set it aside to dry. Okay, while the pencil box is drying, let's go back to the succulent planter. So I take it out of the clamps and I clean up one face of the joiner. I then run it through the planer multiple times until I reach a final thickness of around 1/2 inch. Next I go back to the table saw and I pretty much repeat the same steps I did for the mitered sides of the pencil box. I set my blade to 45 degrees and cut out the 4 sides of the planter. I make a cut, flip the workpiece over and put the mitered side against the stop and make the next cut until I have all 4 sides done. I then cut my sides to final width by trimming some off the top and bottom until I get to about 4.5 inches. This dimension isn't critical, you can make your planter as tall or short as you like. Once again, make sure the joints are tight and don't need any finessing. Also remember to take some time to have fun. I'll take 3 out of 4, that's not bad. Alright, remember how we glued up the pencil box? Well, we're going to do the same thing here, only there's no bottom panel yet. Set the pieces on the blue tape, add glue to the joints, and roll up. Make sure the joints are nice and tight and leave to dry. Oh wait, before you do that, take care of any squeeze out on the inside with a straw. Man, that's satisfying. And while the planter is drying, it's back to the pencil box. I need to make the lid of the pencil box, and I'm going to cut it out of this beautiful figured walnut. I line up my fence to the scribe line, make sure that the feather board is tight to the workpiece, and slowly make my cut. Then it's back to the drum sander to clean up the saw marks, and over to the table saw to cut it to final width based on the dimensions of the box. Next, I'm going to make rabbets on all four sides just like I did with the bottom, but this time I'm going to show you how to do it on the router table. I first set the height of my router bit. I'm using a spiral cutter, but you can also use a straight bit. I aim for leaving just over 1/8 of an inch of material. You want to err on the side of not taking enough material off, that way we can test the fit and sneak up on the perfect thickness. I then set my fence to the correct distance from the edge of the bit. I'm aiming to remove just under 3/16 of an inch, which if you remember is the depth of the groove of the sides of the pencil box. I then run all four sides across the bit using a backer to cut the ends so I don't chip out. Next, I glue a miter key onto the end of the lid, which is going to fit into the miters on the open end of the box. Insert the lid and then sand the end flush with the side of the box. And yeah, I forgot to film it, but you get the idea. Okay, one last jump back to the succulent planter. Once it's dried, I rounded over the edges with the router table and then flushed up the top and bottom at the disc sander. I then cut a small scrap of plywood to the inside dimensions of my planter and drilled a 1/2 inch hole in the middle as a drain. You'll probably never need it because succulents don't require a lot of water, but it's better to be safe than sorry. I then add some glue to the bottom of the planter and tap the bottom into place. Okay, now let's bring both of these projects to the finish line together. I give everything a quick sanding to 220 grit. I'm using an oil wax finish on my pieces. Just apply a little to the inside and outside of each piece and wipe off any excess. Once the wax is dry to the touch, we can go ahead and fill the planter. I add Spanish moss to the bottom of the planter, maybe 1 inch or so. I then add my succulent, leaving it inside the plastic container. Position the moth underneath so the succulent stands straight up. Finally, I add river stones. First, I place the stones around the sides of the succulent to fill in the gaps and hold it in place. I then add a layer to the top to conceal the plastic, and it's done. As for the pencil box, just make sure the inside is dry and fill it with your favorite writing utensils. There should be plenty of room for lots of pencils, erasers, and a sharpener if you want. So both of these projects turned out beautifully and proved to be very worthy uses of the scrap material, and I'm sure that the recipients of these gifts will agree that saving them from the fire pit was a great decision.